The gunfire stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Mira Callahan pressed her back against the frozen wall of a collapsed barn and counted her own heartbeats, because it was the only sound she trusted. Somewhere across the ridge, smoke curled into a sky the color of ash, and she knew, without being told, that the world she had known that morning no longer existed. 3 hours earlier, she had been pouring tea for her grandmother, in a warm kitchen that smelled of baked bread. Now her hands were raw from cold, her boots were gone, lost somewhere in a ditch she barely remembered crossing, and the only thing she carried that still made sense was a folded piece of cloth tucked inside her coat. It was torn at the edges, stained at one corner, but she held it the way some people hold a hand they refuse to let go of. She had not planned to run. She had not planned any of this. But when the messenger arrived that morning, breathless, his coat still smoking faintly from cinders, and said the word retreat, something in Mira's chest had cracked open, because retreat meant only one thing to her. It meant Anton. Anton Whitfield was not her husband. Not yet. But he had asked her, 3 weeks earlier, sitting on the low stone wall behind her family's house, if she would wait for him. She had said yes, before he even finished the question. He had laughed, the kind of laugh that made the cold air feel warmer, and he had pressed something into her palm. A strip of fabric, cut from the corner of the Alliance flag that flew over the command post where he served. Every soldier carried a piece, he told her, a small superstition passed down from the older fighters. If you carry a piece of the whole will always find its way back to you. She had laughed at the time. She did not laugh now. The message that morning had not come from Anton. It had come from a boy no older than 14, sent running from post to post with news that the northern line had broken. Mira had listened to her grandmother's warnings, had listened to her mother's pleading, and had walked out the door anyway, because there are some fears that outweigh every other fear, and the fear of never knowing was the loudest one she had ever felt. The village had emptied within the hour. Carts loaded with blankets and bread rolled toward the hills, children clutching the sides, dogs barking at smoke they did not understand. Mira had gone the other way, toward the border, toward the last place anyone had seen Anton's unit before the line collapsed. She was not foolish. She understood the danger, but understanding danger and fearing it enough to stop moving are two very different things, and Mira had never been good at stopping once she had decided to start. The road north twisted through pine forest, and by midday the snow had begun to fall in earnest, thick white flakes that turned the world soft and silent, as though nature itself wanted to hide what was happening beneath it. Mira walked with her coat pulled tight, her scarf wrapped twice around her face, and the fabric fragment held against her chest like a second heartbeat. She passed families moving the opposite direction, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, with a kind of tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. An old man stopped her once, gripping her sleeve, warning her that the border posts were no longer safe, that the Alliance lines had broken somewhere near the frozen river crossing, that no one knew who held the checkpoints anymore. Mira thanked him and kept walking. By late afternoon, the forest thinned, and she came upon the first sign of what war actually looked like once you stopped hearing about it from a distance and started seeing it up close. A supply cart, overturned, wheels still spinning slowly in the wind. Crates of medical bandages scattered across the frost, some of them soaked through with something dark that had frozen before it could fully sink into the snow. She made herself keep her eyes forward. She made herself keep walking. A voice called out from behind a fallen tree, sharp and cautious. Mira froze, her breath catching in her throat, until the voice repeated itself, and she recognized the accent, the dialect of her own province. A young soldier emerged, no older than 20, his uniform torn at the shoulder, a bandage wrapped clumsily around his forearm. His name, he told her, was Colin Ashford, and he had been separated from his unit 2 days earlier, when the line broke near the river crossing. Mira asked him the only question that mattered. Had he seen Anton Whitfield? Colin's face changed in a way that made her stomach drop before he even spoke. He had heard the name, he said. Whitfield's unit had been holding the eastern flank when the assault came. There had been confusion, smoke, shouting orders that contradicted each other. He did not know what had happened after that. He had run, he admitted quietly, ashamed of the word even as he said it, because running had felt like the only choice that kept him alive. Mira did not judge him for it. She had walked toward danger that morning for reasons she barely understood herself, and she knew better than anyone that fear made people do things they could not fully explain, in either direction. Colin offered to travel with her, at least until they reached the next checkpoint, where there might be someone who could tell them more. Mira agreed, grateful for a companion, in a landscape that had begun to feel less like her homeland, and more like the inside of a nightmare she could not wake from. They walked together through the falling snow, exchanging small pieces of their lives to keep their minds from the cold, and from the silence pressing in from every direction. Colin spoke of his younger sister, waiting for him in a town 2 days south. Mira spoke of Anton, of the wall behind her house, of the strip of fabric she now understood might be the last piece of him she would ever hold. As dusk approached, they crested a low hill and saw it for the first time, the border itself, a wide frozen river separating two nations that had once been allies and were now something far more complicated. On the far bank, structures burned in the fading light. Smoke rose in columns that bent sideways in the wind, and scattered across the ice, dark shapes lay still, in a way that made Mira's chest tighten with a grief she had not yet allowed herself to feel. Colin grabbed her arm before she could move closer, his voice low and urgent. He told her they needed to be careful, that neither side of this border could currently be trusted, that alliances shifted in war faster than anyone could track, and that a lone woman and an injured soldier crossing open ice in the fading light were exactly the kind of targets that got noticed. Mira knew he was right, but knowing did not stop the pull she felt toward that frozen river, toward whatever answers waited on the other side. They found shelter for the night in the remains of a watchtower half a mile back from the border, its wooden beams scorched but still standing. Colin built a small fire in the corner, shielded from view by the tower's broken walls, and for the first time since she had left her village, Mira allowed herself to sit still. She took out the fragment of the Alliance flag and studied it in the firelight. The colors were faded now, the fabric fraying at every edge, but she could still make out the symbol stitched into its corner, the same symbol that had flown over every command post in the region since the Alliance had first formed, years before the current conflict, when two neighboring peoples had chosen unity over division. Colin watched her in silence for a while before speaking. He told her he had heard stories about Whitfield, that the man had a reputation for staying behind to help others retreat safely, that he was the kind of soldier who checked twice to make sure no one was left behind before he allowed himself to move. It was not comfort exactly, but it was something, a small ember of hope Mira could hold on to through the long, cold night. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by distant sounds that might have been thunder, or might have been something else entirely. When morning came, gray and heavy with more snow, Mira woke to find Colin already awake, staring out through a gap in the tower wall toward the river below. Something had changed overnight. The fires on the far bank had burned down to smoldering embers, and figures moved slowly across the ice, gathering the fallen, searching among the wreckage. Colin's face was pale as he turned to her. He told her they needed to go down there, not because it was safe, but because if there were answers to be found, they would be found now, before the scene changed again, before the snow buried whatever remained. Mira stood, tucked the fragment of the flag back inside her coat, and nodded. Her boots, she realized only now, had been lost somewhere in the ditch the day before, left behind in her rush to escape the collapsing barn. Her feet were numb inside her thin stockings, but she did not go back for them. There was no time. There was only forward, toward the frozen border, toward whatever truth waited for her on the ice. As they climbed down from the watchtower and began their descent toward the river, Mira felt something shift inside her, a resolve settling into place, that had nothing to do with courage, and everything to do with love. She did not know what she would find at the bottom of that hill. She only knew she could not stop walking until she found it. The wind picked up as they descended, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and something colder, something that made Colin's jaw tighten and his pace slow with caution. Mira pushed past her own fear and kept moving, one bare foot after another, the cold biting into her skin with every step, until the frozen river came fully into view, wide and white and silent, holding within its ice the answers she had traveled so far to find. She did not yet know that the events of this single morning would change not only her own life, but the story that would one day be told about her, about a woman who walked barefoot into the coldest place on earth, simply because she refused to stop believing that love was worth every risk it demanded. The ice cracked somewhere in the distance, a sound like a gunshot that made every figure on the river freeze in place for a heartbeat, before returning to their grim work. Mira reached the bank first, Colin close behind her. and the scene that spread before them was one she would remember in fragments for the rest of her life, never as a single whole, always as pieces too heavy to hold together at once. Soldiers from both sides moved across the frozen surface, an unspoken truce settling over the wreckage as they searched for their own among the fallen. A woman in a nurse's coat knelt beside a figure near the far bank, pressing bandages against a wound with hands that trembled from cold rather than fear. Mira scanned every face, every uniform, searching for the one she needed to see. A soldier near the bank noticed her staring and called out a warning, telling her the ice was unstable near the center, that 2 men had already gone through that morning, trying to reach a wounded comrade. Mira barely heard him. Her eyes had caught on something near a cluster of broken supply crates, a patch of blue fabric she recognized instantly, the same shade worn by officers of Anton's regiment. She moved before Colin could stop her, her bare feet finding traction on packed snow that thinned into slick ice the closer she came to the crates. Colin called after her, his voice tight with worry, but she did not slow down. She had come too far to stop now, and some instinct deeper than fear told her that whatever waited behind those crates mattered more than any danger the ice could offer. What she found was not Anton. It was a young officer named Peter Langley, barely conscious, his leg pinned beneath a fallen beam, his face nearly the same color as the snow around him. Mira dropped to her knees beside him, ignoring the cold that bit into her skin, and called for help. Colin arrived seconds later, and together with 2 other soldiers who had heard the commotion, they worked to free Peter from the wreckage. As they lifted the beam away, Peter's eyes fluttered open, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked who Mira was searching for. She told him the name, and something flickered across his face, a recognition that made her chest tighten with dread and hope in equal measure. Peter had served alongside Anton in the same regiment, though in a different unit stationed slightly to the west. He had last seen him 2 days earlier, before the assault began, when Anton had been organizing the evacuation of a forward post near the river's bend. Peter did not know what had happened after that, but he remembered one detail clearly. Anton had refused to leave until every soldier under his command had crossed safely to the other side. It was the same story Colin had heard the night before, and hearing it a second time from someone who had actually witnessed it made it feel more real, more solid, something Mira could hold on to as she helped carry Peter toward the makeshift medical station being assembled near the watchtower. The medical station, little more than canvas tents stretched between broken trees, buzzed with quiet urgency. Nurses moved between patients with practiced efficiency, their faces drawn with exhaustion but their hands steady. Mira helped where she could, fetching water, holding bandages in place, anything to keep her mind occupied while she waited for news that never seemed to come quickly enough. It was late morning when a woman named Eleanor Pratt, the lead nurse coordinating the station, approached Mira with a list of names, survivors who had been brought in from the forward post near the river's bend. Mira's finger trembled as it moved down the list, searching for the name that meant everything to her. It was not there. Eleanor, noticing her expression, gently explained that the list was incomplete, that more survivors were still being brought in from outposts further along the river, and that the absence of a name did not necessarily mean the worst. Mira wanted to believe her. She forced herself to believe her, because the alternative was a thought she was not yet ready to hold. Colin found her sitting outside the medical tent an hour later, staring at the fragment of the Alliance flag in her hands. He sat beside her without speaking at first, giving her the silence she needed, before finally telling her what he had learned from soldiers newly arrived at the station. The forward post near the river's bend had held longer than expected, largely because of the officer commanding it, a man who had refused multiple orders to retreat until every wounded soldier had been evacuated. When the post finally fell, the commanding officer had been among the last seen, covering the final retreat across a narrow ice bridge that had since collapsed. Mira asked the question she had been avoiding all day. Was that officer Anton? Colin did not know for certain, but the description matched, and the timeline matched, and something in his eyes told Mira he believed it was true, even before he said the words aloud. She stood, the fragment of flag clutched tightly in her fist, and walked toward the edge of the medical camp, toward the river she could still see glinting coldly in the weak winter sun. Somewhere out there, across that broken ice bridge, was the truth she had traveled so far to find, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that she would not rest until she found it, whatever form it finally took. Eleanor called after her, warning that the ice bridge was too dangerous to cross, that search parties were already being organized to comb the area properly once conditions improved. Mira heard the words, but felt them slide past her without settling, because waiting had never been something she was good at, and every hour that passed felt like an hour stolen from whatever time she and Anton might have left. As the afternoon light began to fade into the long blue shadows of a winter evening, word spread through the camp that a search party was finally being assembled to investigate the collapsed ice bridge and the outposts beyond it. Mira insisted on joining them, and though Eleanor protested, citing her bare feet and the exhaustion clearly written across her face, Colin spoke up on her behalf, telling the search leader that Mira had walked further and endured more in the past 2 days than most soldiers endured in a month of quiet duty. The search leader, a weathered officer named Gerald Finch, studied Mira for a long moment before nodding once, gruffly, and telling her to find proper boots before they departed. A young nurse produced a spare pair, too large but warm, and Mira pulled them on gratefully, feeling the ache in her feet ease slightly, even as the ache in her heart continued to grow with every passing minute. The search party set out just as the sun dipped below the horizon, torches and lanterns casting long, flickering shadows across the snow. Mira walked near the front of the group, her eyes fixed on the darkening horizon where the collapsed ice bridge waited, holding within its broken pieces whatever answer the day still owed her. The collapsed ice bridge lay half a mile downstream from the medical camp, and by the time the search party reached it, full darkness had settled over the river, broken only by torchlight and the pale glow of a rising moon. Gerald Finch called a halt at the edge of the ruined crossing, ordering his men to test the surrounding ice before anyone stepped further, and Mira stood at the back of the group, her heart pounding so loudly she felt certain everyone around her could hear it. The bridge itself had been little more than planks lashed together over the narrowest point of the river, and now those planks lay scattered and broken. Some sunk beneath the surface, others jutting up at odd angles like broken teeth. Finch's men worked methodically, calling out to each other as they searched the wreckage and the surrounding banks, their voices carrying strangely in the cold night air. Colin stayed close to Mira, his own injured arm cradled against his chest, though he insisted on helping wherever he could. Together they moved along the riverbank, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, any sign of life. The search felt endless, each minute stretching longer than the one before it, until finally, near a cluster of rocks close to the water's edge, one of Finch's soldiers called out that he had found something. Mira's legs moved before her mind fully processed the words, carrying her across the uneven ground toward the small crowd gathering near the rocks. What they found there was not Anton, but a young private named Harold Grimes, unconscious but alive, his uniform soaked through and beginning to freeze against his skin. He had been in the water for hours, clinging to the rocks after the bridge gave way beneath him, and it was a small miracle he had survived at all. As the soldiers worked to warm him and prepare him for transport back to the medical camp, Harold's eyes fluttered open just long enough for him to mumble a few disjointed words. He spoke of an officer who had pulled him from the water before the bridge fully collapsed, who had pushed him toward the rocks and told him to hold on, who had then turned back toward the bridge to help others still trying to cross. Mira knelt beside him, gently asking if he remembered the officer's name. Harold's eyes struggled to focus on her face, and for a long moment, she feared he had lost consciousness again. But then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper, and the name he said was the one Mira had traveled so far, through so much cold and fear to hear. Whitfield. He said the name Whitfield. The relief that flooded through Mira was so sudden and overwhelming that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. Anton had been alive, at least at the moment the bridge collapsed. He had been helping others, staying true to the reputation Peter and Colin had both described. But relief gave way quickly to fresh fear, because if Anton had turned back toward the bridge as it was collapsing, what had happened to him after that remained entirely unknown. Finch's men continued their search along the riverbank as the night deepened, their torches casting long shadows across the ice. Mira refused to leave, despite Colin's gentle urging that she should return to the medical camp and rest, that the search would continue at first light regardless of whether she stayed or went. She could not make herself leave, not yet. Not while there was still a chance, however small, that the next stretch of riverbank might reveal an answer. It was nearing midnight when a shout went up from further downstream, where the current had carried debris from the collapsed bridge into a shallow bend in the river. Mira ran toward the sound before she even realized her feet were moving, her borrowed boots slipping on icy stones, her breath coming in ragged clouds in the freezing air. What the soldiers had found was a torn section of uniform fabric, caught on a jagged rock protruding from the ice, along with a leather satchel that had clearly belonged to an officer. Finch examined the satchel carefully by torchlight, and his weathered face grew grim as he opened it to find personal effects inside, letters and a small worn photograph, along with an identification tag bearing a name. Mira did not need to be told the name. She already knew, somewhere deep in her chest, exactly what she would find before Finch even turned to show her. The tag bore the name Anton Whitfield, and beside it, a second tag with the initials of his rank and regiment, confirming everything Mira had feared and hoped in equal measure since the moment she had first heard the word retreat that morning. But a satchel and a torn uniform, Finch reminded her gently, did not necessarily mean the worst had happened. Soldiers lost equipment in chaotic retreats all the time, satchels torn away by debris, uniforms shredded by the same wreckage that had claimed the bridge itself. It was possible, he said, that Anton had survived the collapse and continued on foot, perhaps separated from his unit, perhaps making his way toward safety by another route entirely. Mira held on to that possibility with both hands, refusing to let it slip away, even as the night grew colder and the search continued without further results. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn, Finch called an end to the night search, promising to organize a wider effort once daylight made the terrain safer to navigate. Exhausted beyond anything she had ever felt before, Mira allowed Colin to guide her back toward the medical camp, her steps heavy, her mind a fog of exhaustion and unresolved fear. She still carried the fragment of the Alliance flag inside her coat, and now, in her other hand, she carried the leather satchel that Finch had allowed her to keep, a physical piece of Anton that felt both like a comfort and like a wound she could not stop touching. At the medical camp, Eleanor Pratt met them at the edge of the tents, her face softening with sympathy as she took in Mira's exhausted state. She led Mira to a cot near the fire, wrapped a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders, and told her, gently but firmly, that she needed to rest, that her body could not continue at this pace without eventually breaking down entirely. Mira wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she return to the search the moment daylight broke, but her body betrayed her, exhaustion pulling her down into the cot before she could form the words. She fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep, the satchel clutched against her chest, the fragment of flag still tucked inside her coat, and for a few hours, at least, the cold and the fear and the endless uncertainty faded into a darkness that asked nothing of her at all. She woke to the sound of raised voices outside the tent, and for a moment, disoriented, she did not know where she was or how much time had passed. Colin's face appeared above her, his expression a mixture of urgency and something she could not quite read, and he told her, his voice careful and measured, that Finch's search party had found something at first light, something they needed her to see for herself. Mira rose from the cot immediately, the exhaustion of the previous night forgotten in an instant, replaced by a fresh surge of fear and hope that made her hands tremble as she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and followed Colin out into the pale morning light, toward whatever news awaited her at the edge of the frozen river. The morning light was pale and thin as Mira followed Colin through the medical camp, past soldiers tending fires and nurses changing bandages, past the low murmur of 100 quiet conversations, carrying the weight of a night that had asked too much of everyone. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, not from weakness, but from the strange mixture of dread and hope that made every step feel like it might lead toward either the best or the worst news of her life. Finch stood near the riverbank, with a small group of soldiers, his weathered face unreadable, as Mira approached. He did not speak right away, instead gesturing for her to follow him along the bank to a spot where the ice had begun to shift with the rising sun, revealing a section of the riverbed that had been hidden the night before beneath a thin crust of frozen slush. There, half buried in packed snow near a bend in the river, lay a makeshift shelter built from broken planks and canvas, clearly assembled in haste. Finch explained that one of his scouts had spotted smoke rising from the area at first light, a thin trail barely visible against the gray morning sky, and had investigated to find the shelter occupied by 2 survivors who had been sheltering there since the bridge collapse 2 nights earlier. Mira's heart hammered against her ribs as Finch led her toward the shelter, and when the canvas flap was pulled back, she found herself looking at 2 exhausted, frostbitten soldiers, neither of whom was Anton. Her disappointment was sharp and immediate. But Finch placed a steadying hand on her shoulder and told her to wait, that the two soldiers had information that mattered. One of them, a corporal named Dennis Fairweather, recognized the name Whitfield the moment Mira spoke it. He had been part of the unit holding the bridge during the final retreat, and he had seen Anton personally, in the last moments before the structure gave way entirely. Anton had been pulling wounded soldiers from the collapsing planks, working with a kind of desperate focus that Dennis said he would never forget, right up until the moment the ice beneath the bridge cracked and swallowed the remaining structure whole. Dennis had lost sight of Anton in the chaos that followed, the freezing water, the shouting, the desperate scramble to reach the banks on either side. He did not know if Anton had made it to shore, but he told Mira something that lodged itself deep in her chest and refused to let go. In the final moments before the bridge collapsed, he had seen Anton push one last wounded soldier toward the eastern bank, the opposite side from where Dennis himself had ended up, before the ice gave way beneath them both. The eastern bank, it was a small detail, but it was something, a direction, a possibility, that had not existed an hour earlier. Mira turned to Finch immediately, asking what lay along the eastern bank, whether any search parties had covered that ground yet. Finch's expression grew troubled. The eastern bank, he explained carefully, was contested territory, an area where the front lines had shifted unpredictably over the past several days, and sending a search party there carried significant risk. He was not opposed to organizing an expedition, but he needed to gather more information first, to understand who currently held that stretch of the border, before committing soldiers to the search. Mira understood the caution, even as every instinct in her body screamed to move immediately, to cross that river, and search the eastern bank herself, if no one else would do it. Colin, sensing her restlessness, gently reminded her that impulsive action had already put her in danger once, and that finding Anton would do neither of them any good if she ended up injured, or worse in the process. She forced herself to be patient, though patience had never come naturally to her, and spent the remainder of the morning helping at the medical camp while Finch's scouts gathered intelligence about the eastern bank's current situation. The waiting was its own kind of torment, each hour stretching unbearably as she imagined every possible outcome, some hopeful, some devastating, cycling through her mind without pause. It was early afternoon when one of Finch's scouts returned with news that shifted everything. A small settlement on the eastern bank, a cluster of farmhouses that had served as a temporary field hospital during the fighting, was reportedly still operating, tending to wounded soldiers from both sides who had been unable to reach proper medical facilities. The scout believed it might be possible to reach the settlement by a longer route that avoided the most contested territory, though the journey would take the better part of a day. Mira did not hesitate. She told Finch she intended to go, regardless of what decision he made regarding an official search party, and something in her voice must have convinced him, because he sighed heavily and began organizing a small group to accompany her, including Colin, despite his still healing arm, and two of Finch's most experienced scouts. They departed within the hour, moving along a route that wound through dense forest before curving back toward the river at a point further downstream, away from the areas where fighting had been heaviest. The journey was slow and cautious, every sound in the forest making the group pause and listen before continuing, every shadow between the trees examined carefully before they moved past it. As the afternoon wore on, snow began to fall again, softening the harsh edges of the landscape, but also slowing their progress and obscuring the path ahead. Mira walked near the front of the group, her borrowed boots now soaked through from the wet snow, her hands buried deep in her coat pockets alongside the fragment of flag and the satchel she had refused to leave behind. They reached the outskirts of the settlement as the light began to fade into evening, the farmhouses appearing first as dark shapes against the snowy horizon, smoke rising from several chimneys in thin gray columns. A sentry challenged them as they approached, and after a tense exchange during which Finch's scouts explained their purpose, they were allowed to enter the settlement and directed toward the largest farmhouse, which had indeed been converted into a field hospital. Inside, the warmth of a large hearth fire greeted them, along with the low murmur of dozens of voices, wounded soldiers resting on makeshift cots arranged throughout what had once been a family's living space. A woman moved between the cots with practiced efficiency, her sleeves rolled up despite the cold, her face lined with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been working without rest for days. She introduced herself as Margaret Sutton, the volunteer nurse who had organized the makeshift hospital after the fighting had swept through the area, and when Mira explained who she was searching for, Margaret's expression grew thoughtful, searching her memory for the name among the dozens of soldiers she had treated over the past several days. She did not recognize the name Whitfield immediately, but she offered to check her records, a simple ledger she kept of every patient's name and condition, information she had insisted on gathering despite the chaos, because she believed every soldier deserved to be found by the people searching for them. Mira waited, barely breathing, as Margaret flipped through the pages of her ledger by the light of a single oil lamp, searching for a name that would either end this desperate search or send Mira further into the unknown. Margaret's finger moved slowly down each page of the ledger, and Mira watched every flicker of her expression, searching for any sign of recognition. The minutes stretched unbearably as Margaret worked through the list, occasionally pausing to ask a clarifying question about spelling or rank, each pause sending a fresh wave of anxious hope through Mira's chest. Finally, near the bottom of the third page, Margaret's finger stopped. She looked up at Mira with an expression that was difficult to read, caution mixed with something gentler, and told her that a soldier matching the description had indeed been brought in 2 days earlier, though he had been unconscious and unable to provide his own name at the time. The identification found with him matched the name Mira had given. The relief that washed through Mira was so overwhelming she had to grip the edge of a nearby table to steady herself. But Margaret's expression remained careful, and she quickly explained that the soldier's condition had been serious, that he had suffered a significant injury to his leg during the collapse of the bridge, along with severe exposure from the freezing water, and that while he had stabilized somewhat over the past 2 days, he remained in a fragile state. Mira asked immediately to see him, and Margaret led her through the crowded farmhouse toward a smaller room at the back, once perhaps a bedroom, now converted into a quieter space for the most seriously injured patients. Colin and the scouts waited outside, giving Mira the privacy she needed for whatever awaited her in that room. The space was dim, lit only by a single candle, and it took Mira's eyes a moment to adjust before she could make out the figure lying on the narrow cot against the far wall. Even in the poor light, even with his face pale and drawn from injury and exhaustion, she recognized him instantly, and the sound that escaped her throat was somewhere between a sob and a laugh, an emotion too large to be contained by either. Anton's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady, and Mira crossed the room in 3 quick steps to kneel beside the cot, taking his hand in both of hers. His skin was cool but not cold, a small mercy that told her the worst danger had passed, even if serious risk remained. She pressed her forehead against his hand, and allowed herself, finally, after days of forced composure, to weep freely. It was several minutes before Anton's eyes fluttered open, disoriented at first, struggling to focus in the dim candlelight. When his gaze finally settled on Mira's face, something shifted in his expression, a disbelief that slowly gave way to a fragile, exhausted joy. He tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper, asking how she had possibly found him in the middle of all this chaos. Mira told him everything, the words tumbling out faster than she could properly organize them. The messenger boy, the journey through the forest, Colin and the collapsed bridge, Peter and Harold and Dennis, each piece of the story that had led her, step by step, to this small room in a farmhouse, on the eastern bank of a river, that had nearly taken everything from her. Anton listened, his hand tightening weakly around hers, and when she finished, he simply said her name, softly, as though testing that she was truly real, and not some fevered dream brought on by his injuries. Margaret returned a short while later to check on her patient, and her professional assessment tempered the joy of the reunion, with a dose of necessary caution. Anton's leg had been badly injured in the bridge collapse, and while infection had not yet set in, the risk remained significant, given the conditions under which he had been treated. He needed proper medical care, facilities that could not be found in a converted farmhouse, if he was going to make a full recovery. The nearest proper medical facility, Margaret explained, was located in a town 2 days' journey to the south, well behind the current front lines, and considered safe from the fighting that continued to shift unpredictably along the border. Transporting Anton there would be difficult given his condition, but remaining at the farmhouse indefinitely carried its own risks, particularly if the front line shifted again, and the settlement found itself caught in renewed fighting. Mira did not need to be convinced. She immediately began asking what would be required to arrange the transport, and Margaret, clearly impressed by her determination, promised to help organize a sled and the necessary supplies for the journey, along with 2 of the more able-bodied wounded soldiers who could assist along the way. Colin, when informed of the plan, insisted on accompanying them despite his own injured arm, arguing that he had come this far and would not abandon the effort now that success was finally within reach. Finch's scouts, their original mission now complete, offered to escort the group partway before returning to report their findings to the search command, ensuring that word of Anton's survival would reach the proper authorities. The preparations took the remainder of the evening, gathering blankets and supplies, securing a sturdy sled that could be pulled across the snow, and allowing Anton a full night of rest before the difficult journey ahead. Mira barely left his side throughout those preparations, her hand finding his whenever a spare moment allowed, as though she needed the constant physical confirmation that he was truly there, truly alive, truly saved from the fate she had feared for so many desperate hours. As night fell over the farmhouse, Margaret brought Mira a simple meal, insisting she eat something after days of surviving on adrenaline and desperation alone. Mira accepted gratefully, and as she ate, she found herself finally able to breathe fully, for what felt like the first time since the messenger boy had arrived at her family's door, with news that had upended her entire world. She took out the fragment of the Alliance flag from inside her coat and showed it to Anton, who managed a weak, genuine smile at the sight of it. He told her that carrying a piece of the whole was supposed to bring the whole back to you, just as he had promised her weeks earlier on the stone wall behind her house, and that her faith in that small superstition had apparently been rewarded in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Mira held his hand through the night, dozing occasionally in a chair Margaret had brought for her, waking each time to check that his breathing remained steady, that his condition had not worsened in the quiet hours before dawn. When morning finally arrived, pale light filtering through the farmhouse's small windows, the group began preparing for departure, loading Anton carefully onto the sled and securing the supplies needed for the 2-day journey south. As they prepared to leave the settlement, Mira could not have known that the true test of her strength and resolve still lay ahead, that the road to safety would demand more from her than even the desperate search across the frozen border had already required, and that the journey south would bring challenges that would test not only her physical endurance, but the depth of everything she had risked to reach this moment. The sled moved slowly across the snow-covered ground, pulled by 2 of the more able-bodied wounded soldiers, with Colin taking a turn whenever his injured arm allowed. Mira walked alongside, one hand resting on the edge of the sled where Anton lay bundled beneath blankets, his face still pale, but his breathing steadier than it had been the night before, a small comfort she clung to with every step of the difficult journey. The route south wound through forest paths that Finch's scouts had assured them remained clear of major fighting, though the scouts themselves had turned back after the first few hours, their duty to report Anton's survival to the search command, taking priority over continuing the journey. This left the small group to navigate the remaining distance on their own, relying on a rough map Margaret had provided and the general knowledge Colin possessed of the region's geography. By midday, the weather had begun to shift, clouds gathering thick and heavy overhead, promising more snow before the day was through. Mira watched the sky with growing concern, knowing that heavy snowfall would slow their progress considerably and make the journey more dangerous for Anton, whose condition, while stable, remained fragile enough that exposure to worsening cold carried real risk. They stopped briefly at midday to rest the soldiers pulling the sled and to check on Anton's condition. He had drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the morning, occasionally alert enough to speak a few words to Mira before exhaustion pulled him back under. And each time he woke, she made sure to be there, her face the first thing he saw, her voice the first thing he heard. The snow began falling in earnest an hour after their midday stop, thick flakes that quickly reduced visibility and made the forest path treacherous underfoot. Colin, who had taken point in navigating, called for increased caution, worried about losing the trail entirely in the worsening conditions. Mira felt a fresh surge of anxiety at the thought of becoming lost in this remote forest, with Anton in his current state, but she forced herself to remain calm, focusing on the immediate task of keeping pace with the sled, rather than allowing her mind to spiral into worse possibilities. It was during this difficult stretch of the journey that they encountered another group of travelers, refugees from a village further east, who had also been displaced by the fighting, and were making their way toward the same southern town Mira's group was headed for. Among them was a woman named Charlotte Bishop, traveling with her elderly father and young son, who offered to share information about the safest route forward in exchange for the chance to travel together for mutual protection. Mira agreed readily, recognizing the wisdom in combining their small group with the larger party of refugees, both for safety and for the practical knowledge Charlotte possessed of the surrounding area, having grown up in a village not far from the route they needed to travel. The combined group moved more slowly than either had individually, accommodating the elderly and the very young, but the added security felt worth the reduced pace. As afternoon gave way to evening, the group found shelter in an abandoned farmhouse along the route, its previous occupants having fled the fighting weeks earlier, leaving behind a sturdy structure that provided welcome protection from the continuing snowfall. Charlotte's father, a man who introduced himself as Walter Bishop, proved skilled at building an efficient fire despite the limited materials available, and soon the farmhouse's main room held enough warmth to make the night's rest considerably more comfortable than the previous nights had been. Anton's condition improved noticeably with the warmth and rest, his color returning somewhat, and his periods of consciousness lasting longer as the evening progressed. Mira sat beside him near the fire, feeding him small portions of the simple meal the combined group had prepared from their pooled supplies, grateful for every sign of improvement, no matter how small. Charlotte's young son, a boy of perhaps 8 years named Edmund, took a particular interest in Anton's recovery, asking Mira earnest questions about how he had been injured, and expressing a child's straightforward admiration for a soldier who had helped others escape danger before ensuring his own safety. Mira found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like ages as she answered the boy's questions, the simple innocence of his curiosity, offering a welcome respite from the heaviness of the preceding days. As the night deepened, and most of the group settled into whatever rest they could find, Mira remained awake beside Anton, watching the firelight flicker across his face, still hardly able to believe that he was truly here beside her, alive, recovering, safe from the immediate dangers that had nearly claimed him. He woke briefly in the deepest part of the night, his eyes finding hers immediately in the dim firelight, and he asked, his voice still weak but steadier than before, what had become of the Alliance flag fragment she had carried with her throughout the search. Mira showed him the fragment, still tucked safely inside her coat, and Anton's expression grew thoughtful as he studied it in the flickering light. He told her that the flag represented something larger than either of them, a symbol of unity between peoples who had chosen cooperation over conflict, and that even now, with the border in chaos and the Alliance itself tested by the fighting, that symbol still mattered, still represented something worth protecting and rebuilding once the current crisis had passed. Mira listened to him speak, exhaustion evident in every word, yet conviction still clear beneath it, and she found herself struck by the depth of his commitment to something larger than his own survival, the same quality that had led him to stay behind at the bridge, ensuring others crossed safely before considering his own escape. It was, she realized, exactly the quality that had drawn her to him in the first place, and exactly the quality that had nearly cost him his life. As dawn approached, and the group began stirring for the final leg of their journey toward the southern town, Mira helped prepare Anton for the day's travel, checking his bandages, and ensuring he was as comfortable as possible on the sled. Charlotte approached with news that concerned her, information gathered from a passing messenger who had stopped briefly at the farmhouse during the night, warning that fighting had flared up unexpectedly along a stretch of the route they had originally planned to take. The combined group would need to find an alternate path, one that Walter believed he could navigate based on his knowledge of the region, though it would add considerable time to their journey and take them through terrain that was less familiar and potentially more dangerous. Mira felt the familiar tightness of anxiety return to her chest at this news, knowing that any delay increased the risk to Anton's fragile recovery, but she also understood that pressing forward into active fighting posed a far greater danger to the entire group. They set out from the farmhouse as the sun rose over the snow-covered landscape, the combined group of soldiers and refugees moving together along the alternate route Walter proposed, each person carrying not just their own burdens, but a shared determination to see every member of their small community reach safety, whatever obstacles the remaining journey might still hold in store for them. The alternate route Walter proposed climbed steadily upward through a series of wooded hills, terrain that slowed the sled's progress considerably, but offered a wider view of the surrounding countryside whenever the trees thinned enough to see beyond the immediate path. Mira found herself grateful for the elevation, even as her legs ached from the steady climb, because it meant they could spot potential dangers from a greater distance than the forest paths had allowed. By mid-morning, the group paused at a ridge overlooking a valley below, and it was there that Walter pointed out smoke rising in the distance, confirmation of the fighting the messenger had warned them about the night before. The group's original route would have taken them directly through that valley, and seeing the smoke firsthand made everyone grateful for the decision to divert, despite the added difficulty of the hill route. Anton had grown more alert throughout the morning, able to sit up slightly against the sled's supports and take in some of the surrounding scenery, though Margaret's warnings about his fragile condition remained fresh in Mira's mind, keeping her vigilant for any sign that the journey was proving too taxing for his recovery. He caught her watching him with concern and offered a weak smile, telling her that he felt stronger with each passing hour, though whether this was entirely true or simply meant to ease her worry, Mira could not be certain. Edmund, Charlotte's young son, had taken to walking alongside the sled whenever the terrain allowed, peppering Anton with questions about his experiences that ranged from earnest curiosity to the kind of imaginative embellishment children often bring to stories of adventure and danger. Anton, despite his exhaustion, seemed to find genuine comfort in the boy's company, answering his questions with patience, and even managing occasional moments of humor that made Mira's heart ache with gratitude for every sign of his returning spirit. The group stopped for a longer rest at midday, sheltering beneath a rocky overhang that provided some protection from the wind while they shared a simple meal from their dwindling supplies. Walter estimated they were perhaps halfway to the southern town, though the difficult terrain meant their progress had been slower than originally hoped, and he cautioned that the remaining distance would likely require another full night's travel before they reached safety. It was during this rest that Colin, examining his own injured arm with a grimace, admitted to Mira that the wound had begun to trouble him more than he had initially let on, a dull throbbing that had grown steadily worse over the past day, despite his attempts to ignore it. Mira insisted on examining the injury herself, and what she found concerned her enough that she asked Margaret's assistant, a young nurse trainee named Beatrice, who had joined their group at the farmhouse, to take a closer look. Beatrice's assessment was not immediately alarming, but she recommended that Colin's wound be properly cleaned and redressed as soon as possible, expressing mild concern about early signs of infection that, left untreated, could develop into something more serious. This added a fresh layer of urgency to their journey, as now both Anton and Colin required proper medical attention that only the southern town could provide. The group pressed onward through the afternoon, with renewed determination, the difficulty of the terrain seeming to matter less against the growing awareness that delay carried real consequences for two members of their small party. Mira found herself alternating between checking on Anton and keeping a watchful eye on Colin, whose usually steady demeanor had begun to show subtle signs of the discomfort he was clearly trying to conceal for the sake of the group's morale. As afternoon light began to fade, the group reached a fork in the path that Walter studied carefully, consulting his memory of the region against the rough map Margaret had provided. One route continued along the hills, longer but safer according to Walter's understanding of the current fighting. The other descended back toward the valley floor, shorter but riskier given the smoke they had spotted earlier in the day. The decision weighed heavily on the group, and Mira found herself drawn into the discussion, despite feeling that the choice ultimately belonged to those with greater knowledge of the terrain and the fighting. Charlotte argued for the safer hill route, citing concern for her elderly father and young son. Colin, perhaps influenced by his own worsening condition, leaned toward the faster valley route, arguing that speed mattered more than caution given the medical needs within their group. Walter ultimately made the decision, choosing a compromise that would follow the hills for a while longer, before descending into the valley at a point further south, past where the smoke had been visible, in hopes that this would avoid the worst of the fighting, while still shortening their overall journey time. It was not a perfect solution, but it represented the best balance the group could find between competing concerns, and everyone accepted it with the quiet resignation of people who understood that no choice available to them was entirely without risk. The revised route proved challenging as darkness began to fall, the hills growing steeper, and the path less distinct in the fading light. Mira found herself walking closer to the sled than before, one hand resting on its edge, as much for her own reassurance as for any practical purpose, watching Anton's face for any sign of distress as the sled jostled over increasingly rough ground. It was nearing full darkness when the group finally began their descent toward the valley floor, moving carefully along a narrow path that wound between rocky outcroppings, every step requiring careful attention to avoid a misstep on the icy ground. Edmund, tired from the long day's travel, had fallen asleep against his grandfather's shoulder, and the rest of the group moved in the particular quiet that comes from shared exhaustion and shared purpose. As they reached the valley floor and the terrain finally began to level out, a new sound reached them through the darkness. Distant but unmistakable, the sound of voices carrying on the cold night air, along with the flicker of torchlight visible through the trees ahead. Walter raised a hand immediately, signaling the group to stop, his expression tense as he strained to determine whether the voices belonged to friend or foe, in a conflict where such distinctions had become increasingly difficult to discern from a distance. The group froze in place among the trees, every person straining to listen, as the distant voices grew slightly clearer, carried on the still night air. Walter crept forward alone to a better vantage point, disappearing briefly into the darkness, while the rest of the group waited in tense silence, Mira's hand instinctively moving to rest protectively near Anton's shoulder, as though she could shield him from whatever news Walter might return with. He returned several minutes later, his expression difficult to read in the darkness, and explained in a low whisper that the voices belonged to a supply convoy moving along a road at the base of the valley, soldiers speaking in the dialect of the southern regions, rather than the language of the forces still contesting the border further north. This was, he believed, a good sign, an indication that they had indeed crossed into territory more firmly under control of forces aligned with the town they were seeking to reach. Still, caution demanded they approach carefully, rather than announce their presence outright, given the confusion and shifting loyalties that had characterized much of the fighting throughout the region. Colin, despite his worsening condition, insisted on being the one to make first contact, arguing that his uniform and knowledge of proper military protocol would help establish their group's legitimate purpose more quickly than any explanation Walter or Mira could offer as civilians. Mira wanted to object, worried about Colin's health and the risk of him approaching an unknown group alone in the darkness, but she recognized the wisdom in his reasoning and reluctantly agreed, watching anxiously as Colin moved forward alone toward the road below, his silhouette gradually disappearing into the shadows between the trees. The wait that followed felt like the longest of the entire journey, every member of the group holding their breath, listening for any sound that might indicate trouble. Edmund now fully awake and clinging to his mother's side, sensing the tension even without fully understanding its cause. Anton, alert enough now to grasp the situation, reached for Mira's hand, offering what comfort he could despite his own weakened state. It was perhaps 10 minutes later, though it felt considerably longer, when Colin's voice called back through the darkness, tense but clearly relieved, telling the group it was safe to approach. The convoy, it turned out, was indeed a supply group traveling from the southern town toward a nearby garrison, and their commanding officer, a woman named Isabel Marsh, proved sympathetic to their situation the moment Colin explained the circumstances of their journey. Isabel offered the group space on her supply wagons for the remainder of the journey to the southern town, a welcome relief after the exhausting hill route they had traveled throughout the day. She also had a field medic traveling with the convoy, who immediately began examining both Anton and Colin, providing more thorough treatment than either had received since Margaret's initial care at the farmhouse. The medic's assessment of Anton's condition was cautiously optimistic, noting that while his leg injury remained serious, it showed no signs of the infection that had been the primary concern, and that proper medical facilities in the southern town should be sufficient to ensure a full recovery given time. Colin's arm, however, required more immediate attention. The early infection Beatrice had noted having progressed enough that the medic recommended treatment begin as soon as they reached the town's medical facilities. With this reassurance, the remainder of the journey passed more comfortably than Mira could have hoped, riding alongside Anton on one of the supply wagons, as the convoy made steady progress through the night toward the southern town. Charlotte and her family rode on a separate wagon, Edmund finally succumbing to exhaustion and falling into a deep sleep despite the wagon's steady jostling. Mira found herself, for the first time since the messenger boy's arrival at her family's door, able to simply sit beside Anton, without the constant undercurrent of fear that had colored every moment of the preceding days. She held his hand as the wagon rolled through the darkness, occasionally speaking in low tones about small, ordinary things, the kind of conversation that felt almost foreign after everything they had both endured, yet also deeply necessary, a return to some semblance of normalcy, amid circumstances that had been anything but normal. Anton, growing stronger with each passing hour, asked Mira to tell him more about her journey to find him, details she had only briefly touched on during their initial reunion at the farmhouse. She recounted the full story now, the messenger boy, her family's frantic attempts to stop her, the long walk through the forest, meeting Colin, the frozen border and the search among the fallen, Peter and Harold and Dennis and Finch, each piece of the journey that had brought her to this moment. Anton listened in silence, his grip on her hand tightening at certain points in the story, and when she finished, he told her, his voice thick with emotion despite his continued weakness, that he had never expected anyone to risk so much for his sake, and that he did not know how he could ever properly express his gratitude for what she had done. Mira simply told him that gratitude was unnecessary, that she had done nothing more than what love demanded of her, and that she would do it all again without hesitation, if circumstances ever required it. As the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, the convoy crested a final hill, and the southern town came into view below them, its buildings intact and untouched by the fighting that had ravaged the border region, smoke rising peacefully from chimneys rather than from the destruction of war. The sight brought a wave of relief through the entire group, a visible destination finally within reach after days of uncertainty and danger. Isabel's convoy delivered them directly to the town's medical facility, a proper hospital staffed by trained physicians and equipped with resources far beyond anything the makeshift field hospitals along the border had been able to offer. As Anton and Colin were taken in for proper treatment, Mira stood outside the hospital entrance, the fragment of Alliance flag still clutched in her hand, watching the pale morning sun rise over a town that represented, for the first time in days, genuine and lasting safety. The days that followed passed in a rhythm entirely different from the desperate urgency of the journey that had brought them there. Anton remained under close medical supervision as physicians worked to properly treat his leg injury, cleaning and resetting the wound with far greater precision than had been possible in the field, while Colin's arm responded well to the antibiotics and proper care the hospital could provide, the early infection retreating steadily under professional treatment. Mira spent her days at the hospital, splitting her time between sitting with Anton and helping Charlotte's family settle into temporary housing the town had arranged for displaced refugees. Edmund, resilient in the way only children can be, had already begun making friends among the other children staying in the refugee housing, his earlier fascination with Anton's story of survival having transformed into an eager retelling to anyone willing to listen, embellished further with each new audience. Word of Mira's journey had begun to spread through the town, carried first by Isabel's convoy soldiers, and then by the medical staff, who had heard fragments of the story from Colin and Anton themselves. A local journalist, a woman named Vivian Ashcroft who covered stories for the regional newspaper, approached Mira one afternoon at the hospital, asking if she would be willing to share her account of the journey for publication. Mira felt hesitant at first, uncertain whether she wanted her personal ordeal made public, but Vivian explained that stories like this mattered beyond the individuals involved, that in a time when the border conflict had brought so much division and fear, a story of loyalty and determination triumphing against such difficult odds offered something the region desperately needed, a reminder that connection and commitment could endure, even amid chaos and uncertainty. After discussing it with Anton, who encouraged her to share the story if she felt comfortable doing so, Mira agreed to speak with Vivian, recounting the journey in careful detail over the course of several conversations. Vivian proved a thoughtful listener, asking questions that helped Mira process aspects of the experience she had not fully examined amid the urgency of living through it, and the resulting article, when it was finally published, captured the story with a sensitivity that surprised and moved Mira when she finally read it in print. The article spread further than either of them anticipated, picked up by larger publications interested in stories from the border conflict that offered something beyond the grim statistics of casualties and territorial shifts that had dominated most coverage. Mira found herself, somewhat uncomfortably, becoming a minor figure of public interest, recognized occasionally by strangers in the town who had read her story and wanted to express their admiration for what she had done. Anton's recovery continued steadily through these weeks, his leg healing well enough that he began working with a physical therapist to regain his strength and mobility, determined to return to some semblance of normal function, even if his soldiering days might need to be reconsidered given the extent of his injury. Mira watched his determination with a mixture of pride and continued worry, understanding that his commitment to recovery mirrored the same quality that had led him to risk everything at the bridge in the first place. It was during this period of recovery that the broader situation along the border began to shift as well. Word arrived that the Alliance forces had regrouped following the initial collapse, establishing new defensive lines further south, with support from reinforcements that had finally arrived from Allied territories. The immediate crisis that had displaced so many families, including Charlotte's, showed signs of stabilizing, though the full resolution of the conflict remained uncertain, and likely still distant. Finch, the search officer who had led the initial expedition to find Anton, visited the hospital during this period, having traveled south to deliver reports on the search efforts and, Mira suspected, to see for himself the outcome of an effort he had personally overseen. He seemed genuinely pleased to find Anton recovering well, and he shared with Mira additional details about the aftermath of the bridge collapse, including confirmation that several other soldiers believed lost had similarly been found alive in the days following the search she had joined. This news brought Mira a complicated mixture of relief and grief, gratitude for the survivors balanced against sorrow for those whose fates had not been as fortunate. Finch spoke of this balance with the weariness of someone who had witnessed far more of war's costs than Mira had, acknowledging that even successful outcomes like Anton's survival existed alongside losses that could never be fully reconciled or made sense of. As weeks turned into a month, Anton's physical therapist declared him well enough to walk short distances without assistance, a milestone that both Anton and Mira celebrated with quiet, private joy. On the day of this achievement, as they sat together in the hospital's small garden courtyard, enjoying the first genuinely warm afternoon since the deep cold of Mira's original journey, Anton reached into his own coat and produced something Mira had not expected to see again. It was another fragment of the Alliance flag, larger than the piece she had carried throughout her search, carefully preserved despite everything Anton had endured. He explained that he had kept this piece with him, even during the chaos of the bridge collapse, tucked securely inside an inner pocket that had somehow remained dry, even as the rest of his uniform was soaked through in the freezing water. He told her that the two fragments, hers and his, had once been part of the same whole flag, cut apart when the original banner had been damaged during an earlier skirmish months before the current crisis began. Holding both pieces together now, in the quiet warmth of the garden courtyard, felt to both of them like a fitting symbol of everything they had endured and survived together, separate pieces finding their way back to a shared wholeness, despite everything that had tried to keep them apart. Mira held both fragments in her palms, studying the faded colors and frayed edges that told their own story of survival against difficult odds, and she found herself thinking not only of her own journey, but of the larger story these fragments represented, the Alliance itself, tested and torn by conflict but still holding, still meaning something to the people who had sacrificed so much to protect what it stood for. Spring arrived gradually over the following weeks, the last of the winter snow melting away from the southern town's streets and gardens, replaced by the first green shoots of new growth pushing up through soil that had seen so much hardship over the preceding months. Anton continued his recovery with steady determination, walking longer distances each week, his limp gradually becoming less pronounced as his strength returned. The broader conflict along the border had settled into an uneasy stability by this point, the Alliance forces having successfully re-established their defensive positions with the support of reinforcements, though tensions remained, and the possibility of renewed fighting could not be entirely dismissed. Charlotte and her family, along with many other displaced refugees, had begun making plans to return to their home village once officials confirmed the area had been sufficiently secured. Colin, fully recovered from his arm injury, had rejoined his regiment, though he made a point of visiting Mira and Anton before his departure, expressing gratitude for the bond that had formed between them during their shared ordeal, and promising to stay in contact as circumstances allowed. Mira found herself genuinely moved by his friendship, recognizing that the connections forged during crisis often proved deeper and more lasting than those formed under ordinary circumstances. Vivian's article, meanwhile, had continued to generate interest well beyond what either Mira or Anton had anticipated, and requests began arriving for Mira to speak publicly about her experience, opportunities she approached with the same careful consideration she had given to the original interview. She agreed to a small number of these engagements, always emphasizing that her story represented not just her own actions, but the courage and sacrifice of everyone she had encountered along the way, from Colin and Peter to Harold, Dennis, Finch, Margaret, and Charlotte's family. It was during one such public gathering, organized by regional officials seeking to honor stories of resilience from the border conflict, that Mira and Anton were asked to speak together about their experience for the first time. Standing before an audience that included survivors from throughout the region, along with officials and journalists who had covered various aspects of the conflict, Mira found herself reflecting on the full arc of the journey, in a way she had not fully articulated even to herself. She spoke of the messenger boy whose arrival had upended her ordinary life, of the decision to walk toward danger rather than away from it, of every person who had helped her along that difficult path, and finally, of the moment she had found Anton, alive, despite everything that had threatened to take him from her. Anton, standing beside her, added his own perspective, speaking of the soldiers he had helped evacuate at the bridge, of the responsibility he had felt toward every person under his command, and of his own disbelief and gratitude upon waking to find Mira beside him in that small farmhouse room. The audience listened with rapt attention, and when the couple finished speaking, the applause that followed carried a weight beyond mere appreciation for a compelling story, something closer to genuine recognition of the values their experience represented: loyalty and sacrifice, and the refusal to abandon those who mattered most, even when every circumstance argued for a more cautious, self-preserving choice. After the gathering, as the crowd slowly dispersed, an elderly woman approached Mira privately, introducing herself as someone who had lived through an earlier conflict decades before, when the alliance between the two neighboring peoples had first been forged. She told Mira that stories like hers mattered precisely because they reminded each new generation why the alliance existed in the first place, not as an abstract political arrangement, but as a living commitment between people who had chosen, again and again, to stand by one another, despite every hardship that circumstance might throw against them. Mira carried these words with her in the weeks that followed, finding in them a deeper understanding of everything she had experienced. The alliance flag, the fragments she and Anton had preserved through their ordeal, represented something larger than their personal story, a symbol renewed through each act of courage and loyalty performed by ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. As summer approached and Anton's recovery reached its final stages, the couple began discussing their future together. A conversation that felt different now than it had on that stone wall behind Mira's family home so many months before. They had both changed through the ordeal they survived, tempered by hardship in ways that deepened, rather than diminished, their commitment to one another. They decided to return north eventually, once conditions allowed, not to the border village where the conflict had begun, but to a nearby town, where Anton could continue serving, in a capacity suited to his continued recovery, advising and training newer soldiers, rather than serving on the front lines himself. Mira, for her part, found herself drawn to the idea of formal work supporting displaced families, having discovered through her own experience a depth of resolve and capability she had not fully recognized in herself before circumstances demanded it. On the day of their departure from the southern town, as they prepared to begin this next chapter of their life together, Mira took out both fragments of the Alliance flag, one final time, before carefully sewing them together into a single, small banner, imperfect in its restoration, but whole in the way that mattered most. She and Anton stood together in the morning light, looking north toward the region that had brought them both such hardship and, ultimately, such profound proof of what love and loyalty could endure. The story of the woman who had walked barefoot across a frozen border, carrying nothing but hope and a fragment of shared alliance, would be told and retold in the months and years that followed, growing perhaps larger in some tellings than the actual events had been, as such stories often do. But at its heart, it remained a simple truth that Mira herself understood better than any embellishment could capture, that in the coldest, most uncertain moments life can offer, the choice to keep walking toward what matters most is itself a kind of victory, regardless of what waits at the journey's end.